Hello.
How's your day going?
Oh, pretty well. Just got down from looking through the vineyard. We had some cold weather at the start of the week and had what I hope will be our only frost event of the season. So we're just kind of checking out what happened. That's a pretty regular occurrence for us. It's always just a matter of how how much damage we're going to get. So, like I said, we didn't get. It was cold enough to have frost, and we did get some damage, but pretty minimal. So, if that's all we get this year, we'll be in great shape.
Good, awesome. Always glad to hear that. So good. We're gonna
Yeah,
talk.
this is always good.
Oh, sorry, you're on a little delay. We're talking about Trousseau tonight. Yay! We were just talking about how it's an interesting, variety that you don't see very often. I think, I've talked a little bit about it in the emails about how it was something that used to be planted in our area back in the day. And, we're kind of bringing it back to the bring it back as we do with many different varieties. Matthew's the usher. I don't know the word. You bring the, like Moses, you just bring them back. So yeah, if you want to, I don't know, what do you want to talk about, like the varieties, history in the region, whatever you feel like, the Jura.
Sure. So the varieties history in the region is really I mean that was really one of the main drivers of me wanting to put that variety into the vineyard, along with a deep love of and respect for the wines from the Jura. And I loved, yeah, I love finding Trousseau in California. A lot of times, especially back in, say, like the early to mid 2000s, it wasn't quite as easy to find wines from the Jura in California then as it is now. So, a little grateful for that, to have more access to, some of these amazing bottles produced by our colleagues there. But anytime I could find them, I'd buy them and try to learn a bit more about this grape, and well, the wines in general from the Jura. They're very much their own thing. So a sense of place, as as one would hope a wine would have. But just this, the character in general, this sort of uh, a lightness of a weight that's on the lighter side of the spectrum, but not necessarily a weak or thin or shallow wine. These were wines that that were light and deft on their feet, and yet still had quite a bit of depth and interest. And so I was already predisposed to thinking about Trousseau, and had read a good bit about Trousseau's history in California. In particular, there was I have a pair of friends making wine out of Trousseau in California, who were both using the same clonal material, the same vines that were propagated from the same clonal material. This material came from a site about 45 minutes north of us here at the vineyard in Jackson, California. It was a viticultural research station run by the University of California at Davis until the Depression, basically, at which point they they just walked away from it, left everything as it was and moved out. So they left all these. It was an agricultural research station, not just viticultural. So they were taking a look at what was currently being grown in the foothills in terms of economic crops or economically viable crops. So there were fruit trees, different types of stone fruit, of course, grapevines. Well, when the Depression hit, everyone that was working there just either lost their job or went back down to the university to see if they could keep working there. And the property was just kind of lost with the sort of the flow of time. It turns out that somebody moved on to the property, took possession of it essentially by squatting, and lived there, had family, their kids were raised there. And then sometime in the 80s, a professor of horticulture said, I was reading something in the stacks about this research center that we used to have up in the foothills. Whatever happened to that? Nobody seemed to have an answer. So he took a drive up there and went onto the property and was greeted probably in a not too friendly fashion by the folks who were living there, thinking that the university was turning up again to come reclaim the property and give them the boot. And this horticulturist said, "Oh no, I'm really only here. I'm only interested in any plants, any potential surviving plants that were around when this place was abandoned." And so they let him on, and he collected a bunch of tissue samples, cuttings, things like that from some of the plants that were still going. And it turns out that among them were 3 clones of Trousseau Noir and a couple clones of Pinot Noir. So these 2 friends of mine who were making Trousseau, before I ever got any in the ground, were both using vines propagated from the material that had been rescued from this research station in Jackson back in the 80s. And so it made perfect sense to me. It sounded really cool to get that same material, because then not only would these 2 friends of mine and myself be making wine out of the same clonal material with some variation, but more or less in a very similar fashion, we'd have a very interesting look at the effect of sight on expression of wine, because like I said, our methods are pretty close, pretty similar in terms of what happens inside the winery, and we pick it more or less the same ripeness, pretty close to the same ripeness in general. So it'd really be a difference of sight, a difference of the soil type, the elevation, and then our particular climate through the growing season that would play the big difference. That sounded cool. But then it was also extremely cool to think about bringing this clone back to the foothills, this thing that had been grown 100 years earlier up here. You just again, I loved the idea of reforging a link to that tradition, to that history that had been kind of severed by Prohibition. So those were kind of the things that I was thinking about, when I thought how much I wanted to put Trousseau in the vineyard here. It was a little bit of a flyer in that I'd never worked with Trousseau at any of the other places that I had worked where we did the farming. So it was a little bit of a wild card, not knowing what exactly we were going to be dealing with. I'd had conversations with my friends who were growing it, but until you actually get the plants in the ground and go through a couple of growing seasons, you're going to be in for some surprises. And it turns out that I would guess that one of the reasons that Trousseau was so popular 100 years ago was that it's quite vigorous. It's an enthusiastic grower and bearer. So really worth your time as a farmer. to get out there and get a whole bunch of clusters on those vines. And it's also got extremely thin skins, which is a kind of a counterweight to that, that perspective as a grower. Great, it grows a lot of fruit, but it grows a lot of fruit that has thin skins, which is susceptible to, more susceptible to disease, to rot, to bird damage. It's just it's a consideration. So some pluses, some minuses, but it's been a lot of fun to kind of see how it expresses itself on our site, and to see it come through, and see that expression manifested in a wine that is actually, it's quite its own thing. It's definitely California, but the connection to the wines of the Jura is clear. Like that, those same kind of things that I mentioned earlier. It's a lighter wine, lighter bodied wine, light in color, and yet it's got a ton of tannin. It's got a beautiful aromatics, a ton of presence. It's this really interesting bit of dynamic tension between the appearance, which suggests that the wine might present as one type of thing, and then you take a smell and take a sip, and it presents as something completely different. So that, yes, it's been quite a bit of fun to sort of see how the Trousseau has come along in the vineyard. Imagine what it might have been like to, imagine what it might have been like to grow it and make it 100 years ago. That might be a good segue to go right into how we treat it in the cellar, because while I will readily admit that we have running water, electricity, forklifts, and the convenience of modern presses, we also approach things in a manner that might be pretty recognizable to a winemaker of 100 years ago. The winemaker back then might take a look at fruit coming in and say, "Hey, what do you guys think about destemming this?" And the crew standing around would say something along the lines of, "How?" With no mechanized, or actually at the time there were a few, but they were hand operated and they were not widely used because they weren't mass manufactured. They were, sort of purpose built type machines, as most machinery was in the late 1800s, early 1900s, especially when you're out in the far boondocks like the Sierra Nevadas in California in that time. So anyway, if you wanted to destem fruit back then, pretty much the most efficient way to do it was to have a table with some wooden lattice or wire lattice, and you pick up the clusters, or if the lattice holes in the lattice are small enough, you can just dump the clusters on the table and then just rub them back and forth across the lattice holes. And it sounds primitive, and it sounds really rough on the fruit, but we've actually played around with that a little bit too, and it's kind of amazing how many whole berries come out the other side. You think it's just going to shred them to pieces, and it's actually, I was surprised. It's far gentler than I had thought it would be, but it still takes forever. And so kind of going through that sort of thought exercise and saying, geez, it would have taken forever to destem a ton or 2 tons or 3 tons of Trousseau. So usually they just didn't destem it. Everything that was fermented on the skins, for the most part, I'm making a big generalization here, but for the most part, it was fermented with the stems included. So that's what we do as well. 100% stems in. That would look very familiar to a wine producer of 100 years ago. I think too, the fact that we don't except for some very particular lots, we don't do much carbonic fermentation. So we tread that fruit pretty vigorously at reception to break up the clusters and try to minimize the amount of carbonic maceration in the fermenter. That might have been, again, very familiar to a winemaker, a wine producer from back then. And shoot, we've actually, what might not have been, here I'm getting into some more supposition than anything, but we've been heading down a path of less and less manipulation of the fruit during ferment, but not necessarily, as it turns out, less extraction during ferment, playing around with some submerged cap fermentations to, well, partly to reduce the amount of work that we have to do, which is always a plus during harvest. But as it turns out, it doesn't reduce the amount of extraction you get, actually ups it, and it ups it in a non-oxidative environment. So with a wine like the Trousseau Noir, which, people will snicker when you tell them that you're pouring them a red wine, and they look at our Trousseau in the glass and say, well, cool, when's that red wine getting here? I'll drink this rosé until it does. The color is very light. And during a fermentation where we, we'll do maybe 2 or 3 punch downs or pump overs a day, I, for years, have been making my reds that way. And I had no idea how much oxygen exposure that was actually giving the ferment. And I should say too, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not trying to demonize oxygen exposure during ferment. The yeast definitely love it. It can help with their cell wall viability. A little oxygen during ferment does help their cell wall viability, excuse me. But what we discovered in trying out this submerged cap ferment with the Trousseau Noir was that the color was not oxidized during ferment. So we actually got a brighter, more intense color, not necessarily darker. It's definitely not darker. There's not a lot of color in our Trousseau Noir, for sure. But the kind of the shade of it, the part of the spectrum that it was falling on was far more toward the sort of intense, luminous, glowing side. And the tannin was much, much more noticeable. So we actually, without doing any hard work on the ferment, I guess conventional wisdom would be, if you want more tannin, agitate the cap more so that you get more, you're breaking skins up more, you're releasing more skin tannin, you get those seeds out, get the seeds in contact with the wine. Well, we're doing this submerged cap. We had far more tannin and smoother too, like kind of a little more, less of the kind of angular, harsh tannin right out of the ferment. A little bit more, more smooth and suave tannin, the kind of tannin that you might expect to see after a decent amount of élevage in the cellar. So I don't know if 100 years ago many people were playing around with the old submerged cap. So that might have been a little strange for our time traveling wine producer to see us do. But then we don't do any extended post ferment skin contact. So basically, as soon as the ferment is winding down, we get down to 0 Brix or just under, put that ferment in the press, put it down to, we might settle it overnight in a tank, and then barrel down just to leave behind some of the really, really thick gross lees. But it goes down to barrel with a fair amount of lees, fairly dirty, and then it hangs out there for well, I guess it varies, 6 to 8 months sometimes. This isn't something I really aim to over vintage. Like to get it in, typically like to get it in bottle before the next vintage, but sometimes that doesn't happen. Plans, they're overrated.
Did you make a trousseau before
So
RHV? I didn't think so, but
I did, but not a, never released. I just, yeah, so I worked with it for one season, and that was actually a tiny little bit of, wow, it would have been, something along the lines of like 30 vines at Roger King's place in Sassoon. That we had put in, and I made a tiny little ferment with, and bottled up maybe I want to say 5 or so cases of 375s. I mean, it was that small. But that was the same propagation material again. So again, if I can find a bottle of that somewhere, we should open it sometime and check it out, because again, like looking at it as a strictly site driven, or the majority of the differences being site driven, you could look at the Forlorn Hope, that little 375. So you've got Calaveras, Sassoon, and then the other two fellows that I mentioned, Tegan Passalacqua, his Sandlands trousseau's grown out on the Sonoma coast at Bohan Dillon. So totally different site than we have. And then Duncan and Nathan at Arnott Roberts sourced their trousseau from the Luxinger vineyards up in Lake County. And that is entirely different again. So you get, yeah, all the same clonal material, so typically theoretically the same vines, just on different sites. Really kind of a fun comparison.
so interesting. I did not realize he had Trousseau Noir in addition to Trousseau Gris. That's cool.
Yeah, I'm trying, as I was saying that, I was trying to remember when I got those cuttings. You know what? Hold on. Don't take everything I just said seriously. Everything I said about the Forlorn Hope, Sandlands, and Arnott Roberts is right.
For sure.
That trousseau from Sassoon, let's just throw that out for the moment. That might have actually been trousseau sourced, or that clonal material might have been sourced from the library vineyard in St. Helena, not from Luxinger, and that's a totally different clone. So,
what are the like Trousseau Noir and Trousseau Gris? Are they like wildly different to work, like when they grow, what to work with? What's the deal with that? Because I've never messed with the Trousseau Gris, because it was done really by the time I came on board. So I think I did one punch down in 2016.
Well,
that was it. That was my first punch down, was Trousseau Gris.
I think, Trousseau Gris, phenologically, well, here's what I'll say. The one experience, like the main experience I have with Trousseau Gris is the vines that were grown by Roger King. I sourced those cuttings from a vineyard that's since been plowed under and replanted. So the source vineyard doesn't exist anymore. But in the 80s, it was, and actually, I don't know when they stopped making it, but definitely 70s into 80s, Stony Hill produced what they called a gray Riesling from that vineyard. And it, so if you can imagine that, if you're familiar with what Riesling looks like when it's growing, there are these, typically these, fairly compact, tight clusters. The Trousseau Gris actually kind of looks like that. So I gray Riesling, I think like, yeah, right, come on. It doesn't, does it really look like a gray clone of Riesling? But it's actually, it's in, okay, I'm like, all right, I could see that. But this one particular, like I said, this one vineyard that I have experience with also was had some other issues. Boron in the soil, an excess of boron that had a pretty significant impact on vigor and vine growth and fruiting. And I'm not, so I wasn't really sure if those, if the morphology of the clusters and the leaves on the vines that I was working with was typical of Trousseau Gris across the board. There are similarities visually or ampelographically between the Trousseau Noir and the Trousseau Gris. But if you had them side by side, I mean, it wouldn't be like Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir, where you're like, okay, yeah, see, like clusters look the same, leaves are similar. Totally, I get this. And then to just be even more, kind of make things a little more confounding, the folks in the Jura have never seen it. They don't grow it there. It doesn't exist there. They think it's a California invention. Even though genetically, yes, it is just a color mutation of Trousseau Noir, but it must have happened, maybe when it got to Portugal, or maybe when it got here, or maybe even when Trousseau got to Australia, and then the Gris was brought. I really don't know when or where, that Gris mutation came in, but it is kind of funny that the Jura are just like, what? You make this up. This doesn't exist. This is bullshit.
That's awesome. I did not realize that.
Yeah, so it's a weird one. And I would also say too that, in terms of making the wine, again, because of that site, because of that, like the site that I was saying, we like the particularities of the site that Trousseau Gris was grown on, it did not ripen the way that I would expect it to normally. And the only other producing vineyard of Trousseau Gris at that time, I don't know if anybody else has planted it since, but the Finucane Wood Vineyard in Sonoma was the only other producing vineyard of Trousseau Gris at that time. And when I saw bottles of, some of our friends' versions of Trousseau Gris from the Finucane Wood Vineyard, it at times was darker than our Trousseau Noir is now. And the Trousseau Gris that I made out of Rogers Vineyard only ever was like copper colored at the best. Like there was next to no color in that fruit. So I think on a different site, the Trousseau Gris actually will be kind of like you think of Pinot Noir to Pinot Gris and how dark Pinot Gris can actually be. I think it's more like that, but I've never worked with it from anywhere except for that one really kind of unique site that generates this unique expression of it.
So cool.
But as far as like actual kind of like familial similarities, or you're like, hey, I can tell you're related. If you dug out a bottle of our old True Grit and poured it next to the ODB, you'd be like, nah.
That would be a very interesting thing to do, actually. Mostly because I
think the Trousseau Gris looks a lot more like the Milkman.
Yeah, I haven't had the Trousseau Gris in ages. I don't even know, probably 2017. So I haven't even seen a bottle of that kicking around in nowhere. So that would be very interesting. And I was saying earlier that I feel like I say this about a lot of our wines, but really the Trousseau Noir is one of my favorite wines that we make because of how, like you said, it's not what you expect when you're looking at it. And it has such a fun assortment of flavors and aromas, but is also just like such an easy thing to drink. Like you do not need to nerd out about it. It's not like, it's just like, oh, this smells like Jolly Ranchers. And then you just drink it and have it's so nice.
It's true. And you can just drink it from, midday,
Mm.
hanging out outside, cruising around, whatever. You've got it in a cooler on into, early evening, getting the grill together, from, yeah, afternoon through into evening. You don't even have to think about like, oh, what should we be drinking now? That will go with you all the way through. It's easy to drink and yeah, just hugely versatile. Yeah.
It's the summer red, y'all. Cool. They're going to kick us off. So thank you guys for coming. Thanks for all the dropping the knowledge on the Trousseau on us. I always learn a lot from you when we do these, even though I work with you all the time. So always fun. Thank y'all so much. Happy Friday. Woohoo.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Chris.
Love you guys.
Bye,
Thank
Sally.
you.
Good to see
Take care.
you.
Bye. Thank
Love
you.
you. Bye.
Ciao.
Ciao. Ciao, Bella.